Putting up the spotting scope, we quickly identified a pretty good 4-point and what looked like two 2-points. They were far enough away that it was hard to get a real good fix on how good this 4-point was, so we just kept watching as every now and then it would walk in just the right spot that would allow us a little better look at its antlers. Eventually they either bedded up or moved out of sight. While Aubrey was watching, she spotted what she thought looked like a really wide set of antlers in the brush. I looked at it, and while it was tough to see, I thought the same thing. Well, the only way to know would be to hike the 1,000 feet elevation up to where these deer were to get a better look. So with that, we threw on our packs and headed on up.
Time to peek over. It's like Christmas, seeing what we got over there.
Hoping there was a shooter just over the ridge, we went ahead and loaded the gun. Surprisingly, it took a minute to find the buck that was straight across from me and in plain sight. It was obviously the 4-point we've been watching from down below. I also spotted a little 2-point bedded directly above the 4-point. That was 2 of the deer located, but where were the others? I knew for sure there were at least 3 deer and maybe more. I quickly explained to Aubrey what I'd spotted, and she took a look at the 4-point as well. As you can tell, it was a pretty buck. Good all-around depth on all its forks and nice dark antlers. It wasn't the biggest buck out there, but still a nice buck. There was still the possibility of another buck somewhere, the one I thought I'd seen bedded up. So I left the camera on the buck for Aubrey to keep an eye on while I kept looking for the other deer. While I was working different angles trying to see the other areas to see if we had some other bucks, a doe stood up that had been bedded up just above those other 2 bucks, and we hadn't even seen it. It had obviously been watching us and was a little spooked. Well, that big buck wasn't going to let the doe out of sight, so it got up as well and started following it. Knowing if there were any other bucks around, that would get them up as well, I made sure to have Aubrey ready in case a bigger one stood up. However, no other deer did show up. Just that little 2-point we already knew about. It also got up and slowly followed the doe and 4-point, which were keeping a steady pace up and away from us. All we could do was watch and wonder if we should have played this differently.
So we don't know if there were other deer that went up and over earlier while we were gone, or if this was it and I was imagining things. So who knows? But that was a pretty buck. That's one we might regret passing on because it was in range for a shot.
Well, we hunted several more days and saw a lot of deer. We just couldn't find a big shooter. We saw coyotes and elk, but again, not the big buck we were looking for. Finally, near the end of the season, we spotted some deer that had a couple bucks in it. We just couldn't quite make out how big they were. As we got to some rocks that would give us cover, we dropped our packs and, like so many times before, peeked around to see what we had. Surprisingly, I couldn't find a single deer. They'd all disappeared. It was actually Aubrey that spotted them a ways off, feeding up 2 ridges over. Right off the bat, we watched a 2-point feed up and over the ridge and disappear. We thought there had been 2 bucks, but none of the other deer we could see had any antlers big enough to see with just our binos. Either I'd been seeing things or the other buck had already left as well. Taking one more quick look before leaving, I noticed something odd in the thicker sagebrush. That's when I realized there was a deer bedded up. I pulled out the spotting scope and sure enough, it was the second buck. And to our surprise, it was a good looking buck. The more we watched, the bigger it looked. It was wider than its ears and had nice tall tines. This was definitely the biggest buck we'd seen up until this point.
So we were taking just one more glance because we knew there was 2 bucks. We had seen at least 2 bucks. We'd only seen the 2-point. So we were glassing a little bit more and found a really decent, solid 4-point bedded down. So we're gonna go after him.
So the game plan was simple enough. Get into range. However, as you might guess, it wasn't as simple as that. We had to do quite a hike to drop down and over and get onto the ridge it was on, only to hike back up again. When we finally were nearing the spot we'd hoped we could see them from, it had been over an hour, so we didn't know if they were still there. As you can see, it was a very steep and rocky hillside we were sneaking up, so we were trying very hard to be quiet and not to roll rocks down that would give us away. I peeked over and sure enough, there he was at 150 yards. However, we could easily back off and move up another 25 yards closer. With a muzzleloader, every yard counts. Moving over, we once again started up the slick hillside. I think we were both pretty excited knowing he was there and in range. Well, I was so busy watching my step trying to be quiet that I didn't realize I'd cleared my cover. As I looked up, I was disappointed to see the buck staring right at me. The buck quickly trotted up to where the does were, and so I got Aubrey's attention and had her hurry up. She was slipping on the rocks, but finally got set, threw down the bipods, and got ready for a shot.
Hurry, come here. Just get on there. Right on its back. Right on the back. Safety off?
Yeah, please.
Wait for him to get clear.
I won't see him.
Just wait for him. Can you see him?
Yeah. Where's my dog?
I know.
Now it was a waiting game. We just needed the other deer to move a little and give us a clear shot. At this point, I was very frustrated that I'd blown this stalk. After all the time trying to find a good buck, and I blew it. If only the buck would get clear of these other deer and give Aubrey a shot, we might get a second chance.
Okay, wait. There's one below it. If he comes walking back around.
They actually stood there for some time before the deer below finally walked clear. That's when we realized that while it was clear of the other deer, now it was skyline. And if you remember from Hunter's Ed, not a good shot if you don't know what's behind it. So now we have the dilemma, shoot or don't shoot.
So we might want to wait.
Well, we waited, hoping it would take a few steps down, giving the better shot. When it finally started walking, I told Aubrey to get ready. Unfortunately, with the other buck in the way, she still had no shot, and then it went behind the brush and turned and trotted straight away from us out of sight. As soon as the does ran off, we grabbed our stuff and hurried on over to find them again. We still had a couple hours of daylight, so plenty of time. Meanwhile, I'm curious what you would have done had you had this shot opportunity, because we sure did a lot of second guessing. Let me know in the comments. We'll see if Aubrey tags out in part 2 of Aubrey's muzzleloader hunt. If you liked what you saw, please subscribe to the Outdoor Youth Challenge YouTube channel.